He's a friend and colleague. We overlap in 3 different areas here at Duke, evolutionary anthropology most of all, but also Duke Global Health. And Herman is also on TriSem's advisory board and a very valuable member of that board, very giving of his time in terms of TriSem's activities. And we overlap outside of work sometimes too, which is fun. I'm excited to have Herman here to present his work on metabolism, which I think is absolutely fascinating. His work really challenges a lot of assumptions that we have about metabolism, exercise, and body weight, and more. I find that's true personally. I often think about the work that he's doing and how it really challenges some of the assumptions that I make about these things. And of course, it's highly relevant to evolutionary medicine, so it's really exciting to have him here to share this work. And it also gives him a chance to plug his new book, Burn, which was just published, I think, a week ago. I've got a copy, and I want to encourage everyone else to get a copy. It's a great book. So I'm going to turn things over to Herman. Go ahead, Herman.
All right. Thank you for having me. See if the share screen works like it should here. Everybody see my screen all right? Good. Great. Well, thanks for the invitation to come and talk to everyone here. I've enjoyed being a participant in these, being an audience member for these Club EvMeds, and it's just been really fun. And as Charlie said, I focus on human evolution and evolutionary perspectives on human health in my work. And most of it revolves around the way that we burn energy, because, from an evolutionary perspective, life is a game of turning energy into kids. And a lot of my work has been looking at how humans differ from other primates. So for example, if we look at humans compared to the other apes, we burn more energy than other apes do. Our metabolisms have accelerated evolutionarily. And that increase in daily energy expenditure seems to be behind a lot of what makes us human, right? So we burn more calories, and that allows more energy for things like bigger brains, more activity, longevity in babies. So there are sort of a whole series and whole area of evolutionary biology questions we can ask by focusing on energy expenditure. But, as you can imagine, if we are focused on energy expenditure, we get into issues of metabolism and how we bring energy in with our diet and how we burn it off with things like physical activity. A lot of this work has also sort of bled into discussions in public health and evolutionary perspectives on public health, because of course, our metabolism is at the center of what makes us human, right? But it's also increasingly at the center of what makes us sick. And so as I'm sure everyone here is aware, there's an obesity crisis in the US and other parts of the industrialized world. And that's come on in the last few decades as we have, as a population, become more and more overweight and obese. And your weight is simply a function of how many calories you've brought in and how many calories you've burned off. And so it's directly tied to your metabolism. And you can see here, increasingly, we are overweight and obese as classified by BMI in the US and elsewhere. And that has direct implications for health. And so, people have questioned BMI as a useful measure of health risk and health classification. And those discussions are important to have. But from an epidemiological point of view, obesity is actually a pretty good measure of risk at a population level. So if we look at your likelihood of developing 2 or more of diabetes, heart disease, or stroke, these cardiometabolic diseases, those risks go way, way up if you are overweight or obese BMI. It's not just that, your likelihood of dying from certain kinds of cancer go up, and relevant to right now, your likelihood of COVID complications and hospitalizations go up at higher BMI. And so here you have metabolism, which, I got into this work, again, as an evolutionary biologist, thinking about how important it is to understand the way our organism spends its calories, its limited resources. But this work has spilled in directly into questions about how we manage our health today, and not just in the evolutionary past. To put this in further perspective, it's not just, we talk about these diabetes and heart disease and stroke as diseases of civilization or diseases of industrialization. But it's not just the rich world that's encountering these diseases anymore. If we look globally, cardiometabolic diseases highlighted here are actually the major killers worldwide. So it's not just the rich parts of the world that are dealing with this. It's lower and middle income countries as well. Here is global mortality rates. And you can see that, globally, heart disease, stroke, and diabetes account for most of the deaths every year. To put COVID-19 in perspective, in the last 12 months, it's killed about 2.5 million people, which of course is an enormous tragedy, but is actually, if we want to compare the numbers, is actually less than cardiometabolic disease. So if metabolism is so central to how our bodies work and every aspect of our lives and something that you wouldn't think you could screw up, how do we screw it up? And so that's the question I want to focus on today. And the point I want to make throughout this talk is that a lot of what we have gotten wrong with managing our metabolism is sort of at a societal level stems from, I think, a misunderstanding of how metabolism works at a fundamental physiological level. And so I've sort of arranged this talk from an evolutionary perspective, thinking about how metabolism has worked in the past and how an evolved metabolism functions today. So I'll lean a lot on work I've done with hunting and gathering and other small scale societies in my work. But I will also arrange it sort of around sort of what I want to call 7 metabolic myths, the way that we get metabolism wrong often. Certainly in the public sphere, we see this getting talked about incorrectly. But I think even in the fields of metabolism, even in the field of cardiometabolic health, there are still some sort of old ideas that need to be updated. And we would do better to update them sooner rather than later. And so I've arranged this talk to hopefully pick a fight. It's going to talk about 7 things that I think we can do better and that we often get wrong. And I hope that this provokes a kind of back and forth with us in this discussion later on in the time today. Okay, so without further ado, let's jump into 7 metabolic myths. And the first I'll talk about is this idea that exercise boosts your metabolism. That is somehow, if you're more and more physically active, you can burn more and more calories a day. And I think that's grossly overstated. And the reason I think that stems from work that I did with Dave Reichland and Brian Wood starting about 10 years ago. So this is the Hadza Hunter-Gatherer Energetics Project. So Dave and Brian and I went and collected some of the first direct measurements of daily energy expenditure with hunter-gatherers using a technique called the doubly labeled water method. So the Hadza they're hunter-gatherers. They get all of their food from the wild plants and wild game. They don't have any domesticated crops or domesticated animals, no machines or guns or anything like that. They get all their food from the wild savanna around them. And so, they're a modern population like any other population on the globe is today. But because they hang on to these old traditions, these old sort of lifestyle elements, they're a way to ask the question, what would our physiology look like, any of us, if we grew up in a hunting and gathering population? And by the way, humans are a hunting and gathering species. We've been hunting and gathering for millions of years. And so this is the ecologically relevant lifestyle for our species. Okay, so I won't belabor this point, but as you can imagine, hunter-gatherers are incredibly physically active and the Hadza are no different. So women get about 13,000 steps a day gathering plant foods. Men get about 19,000 steps a day hunting. And if you look at minutes a day of moderate and vigorous physical activity, they rack up about 2 hours a day. That's 5 to even more times more than we get in the West. So they, the sort of general way to think about this is they get more physical activity in a day than most Americans get in a week. And you can imagine then that we would expect if exercise and physical activity can boost your metabolism, that a population like the Hadza ought to have quite high daily expenditures compared to more sedentary populations in the industrialized world and in the West. And so we actually tested that by measuring, again, energy expenditure in the Hadza against Westerners using doubly labeled water, which is really the only way to go, the only gold standard method for measuring energy expenditure, calories per day, in free living subjects. So you get about a week to 10-day measurement of average calories per day based on this physiological measure of doubly labeled water. We can talk more about that later if people are interested. So we expected the Hadza to have much higher expenditures than everybody else. But when we actually look at the data, what you find is against fat-free mass, which is the best measure of size, but we can do multivariate stats as well. Daily energy expenditure for the Hadza, here every dot is a man or woman, open symbols are women, closed symbols are men. Gray is people from the US and Europe and other industrialized economies. There's no difference in daily energy expenditure between the Hadza and folks in the US and Europe. Now, that was a big surprise and suggests that maybe exercise doesn't have the effect on metabolism that we think it does. But what if it's just the Hadza? And so we went, and in the last 10 years or so, we've been looking for other opportunities to test this idea, test this relationship. The next one I'll talk about is work that was led by my postdoc at the time. He's now a professor at Baylor, Sam Urlacher. He measured energy expenditures in the Schwarr population, and specifically in the children there. Of course, with childhood obesity being a big issue in the West, this is directly relevant to public health in the US and elsewhere. And, as you can imagine, kids in the Amazon basin, in the remote sort of horticultural villages in the Amazon basin, they are incredibly physically active, going out with their parents to help collect food, for example, and other things. And so if we look at accelerometry measured in physical activity, the Schwarr are more physically active than we see in industrialized settings. They also, this is interesting, they also have higher basal metabolic rates. And those higher basal metabolic rates are related to how much infection burden they're dealing with. So the kids, if you look at how much IgG in this measure against how elevated their BMRs are relative to what you'd expect for a kid their age and size, they are elevated and they seem to be related directly to infection burden. Okay, so here we have a population, these kids are more physically active. They actually have higher BMRs because of this high degree of infectious burden. We would expect then, of course, to see higher total energy expenditures, the total calories spent per day. And so Sam measured that as well using doubly labeled water. And it's the same, surprise, surprise, it's the same as it is in the West. And so here against fat-free mass again, but we do the stats, of course, in multivariate space, but just to show you against fat-free mass, daily energy expenditure is the same for Schwarr children and for children in the industrialized world. Well, maybe it's just the Schwarr. So, sorry, before I go to the next population, I want to say that maybe, one fault that people have had with these comparisons is you compare the Hadza to folks in the US or Europe, or the Schwarr to kids in the US, there are the possibility that you're comparing, genetically different populations, populations that are just hugely different in ecology and culture. And so what you would want, if you want to kind of look at these epidemiological transition questions, is to look at populations in places like the Schwarr that are getting more and more urban and more market integrated, right? To actually kind of catch that epidemiological transition to an industrialized market integrated economy in action. And so Sam just recently published that in Journal of Nutrition 2021. So here's what I just showed you, that total energy expenditures are the same for Schwarr kids and kids in the US and Europe, although the resting energy expenditures are higher with a Schwarr because of that pathogen burden. Sam just recently published the other piece of his postdoc project with us, which is that if we look at urban Schwarr, so these are kids in the Schwarr population that live in and around cities, might be too large of a term, sort of small cities, big towns. They also have the same energy expenditures as everybody else. Their basal metabolic rates are in the middle. And we're seeing pretty consistent constrained energy expenditure across the board, even in these more urbanized populations of Schwarr kids. Now, even though energy expenditure is not changing, body fat percentage is changing, right? So the issue with body fat change and body composition change as we go from really rural and physically active to more industrialized and very sedentary is clearly not about a change in energy expenditure. It's reflecting a change in energy intake. And sure enough, when Sam looked at these data, he could show very nicely that increased body fat was related to several markers of dietary change between rural and urban Schwarr children. Okay, but back to this question about energy expenditure being constrained and not moving in response to lifestyle. I'll share this last population with you that we've worked with, the Chimani in the Amazon River Basin. This is work led by Mike Gervin and Hillard Kaplan. We did the analysis of the doubly labeled water. And just to show you what this looks like, so here's physical activity again, and here's in men and women cohorts. And here's the Hadza, which we talked about, the Chimani. And here are a bunch of other industrialized populations. Some are more agricultural than others, but a lot of highly industrialized populations here. And I've rank ordered these cohorts, these male and female cohorts, in order of how physically active they are. And this is accelerometry measured activity. Now, if activity was the main determinant of expenditure, and if daily expenditure just correlated nicely to activity level, then we would see the same plot, right? In terms of, if we put it in terms of calories per day, but we'd see the same plot, but with just the units would change. Instead of activity, we'd see calories per day. Instead, when we do that, when we look at size adjusted energy expenditures, there's absolutely no relationship between who's higher and who's lower over here in terms of energy expenditure, and who's higher and who's lower over here in terms of physical activity. And so there just isn't a relationship between energy expenditure and physical activity across populations. More active populations do not burn more energy per day. And even within a population, even if we get you exercising more and change your lifestyle, that doesn't have the same effect, that doesn't have the effect on expenditure that we'd expect either. So here's a classic study looking at people training to run a half marathon. And as they went from running 0 minutes a day at the beginning to 20 minutes a day, 4 times a week, 40 minutes a day, 4 times a week, 60 minutes a day, 4 times a week over the course of the year, their energy expenditures initially go up a little bit. We'd expect them to keep going up then as they get more and more active. But instead, this is the female cohort, but the male cohort was similar. Energy expenditures actually come back down. That's that black line there. And they plateau. And I would argue this is constrained energy expenditure. That increased physical activity is leading to decreases in other expenditure. Okay. It's not just humans, by the way. We see the same relationship with mice. Mice in a cage without a wheel, and then given access to a wheel, their activity climbs. Daily energy expenditure, other than this period of adjustment here, is a total flat line relative to activity. So metabolism is dynamic. It adjusts to keep energy per day in check. And this is one of the reasons that exercise seems to be a really poor tool for weight loss. So this is the second myth I'll talk about today. And I should say the other myths will go faster here. I'll move a little bit quicker. But we've known for a long time that exercise is great for a lot of things. It's really important for your health. It's a poor tool for weight loss. And so if we look at how long an experiment is carried out versus how much weight loss happens, right, for different exercise and intervention studies. So these are 63 studies, 67 cohorts, over 900 subjects. And we plot how long did this study last versus how much weight did people lose relative to how much you'd expect them to lose based on their exercise regime. And there you go, right? At early, in the early weeks and months after somebody starts a new exercise program, results are all over the map. But often, and inevitably, actually, as the experiment goes longer and longer, as your exercise program goes longer and longer, your weight loss approaches a vanishing fraction of how much you would expect to lose based on your exercise program. And so this is for two reasons. One is that, like I said before, your metabolism seems to adjust to keep energy expenditure more or less in check. But the second piece of this is, even if you are able to get your energy expenditure up with exercise or anything else, your brain does a very good job matching that expenditure to intake. You basically eat your gains. So when you burn more, you eat more. So exercise ends up being a pretty bad tool for weight loss. You might lose a couple kilos, and that's not nothing. And there are lots of other health benefits, so you should do it anyway. But it's not going to have substantial weight loss effects for most people. Okay, myth 3, that exercise isn't working if you don't lose weight, right? So you should still do it. And that's because of what happens as you exercise more. So imagine these two people here, they're both sedentary. This person decides to change their life and start an exercise program. Okay, so for a while, their total energy expenditure goes up because activity energy expenditure goes up. But what we see in both in controlled studies and what we seem to be seeing epidemiologically is that over time, the body will adjust and spend less on this other stuff. Well, what is this other stuff? Well, partly it's things like inflammation, stress reactivity, and reproductive hormones. And the reason we think that, and I should say this is work that we're still fleshing out and testing right now actively. This is an active area of research, but this is my hypothesis that this is what's happening. And why do I say that? And that's because we know that exercise is good for us for a lot of things, including, for example, decreasing inflammation levels. So people who exercise more in the NHANES data set, high activity people, have less C-reactive protein level, are less likely to be elevated in terms of CRP levels. Reproductive hormone levels, this is a great work done by Anthony Hackney's lab. If you look at people who are sedentary, men who are sedentary, compared to men who have run for 1 year, or for 2 years, or for 5 years, or 10 or 15, you can see testosterone levels, baseline testosterone levels, respond to how long you've been training, right? And I should say this is interesting too, because this gives you a sense of how long, so these are cross-sectional data, so with a grain of salt here, but this gives you a sense of how long it might take for your body to adjust to a new lifestyle. It might actually take more than a year. But anyway, these lower levels of testosterone are actually exactly what we see when we look at traditional societies, like the Hadza, or like the Aceh, or like other populations that were measured when they were physically very active, small-scale societies. Exercise also reduces stress reactivity. So this is a within subject study looking at women with mild depression that were either sedentary or would jog. So there were sort of two periods in this study. It was a crossover design. During the sedentary periods, their 24-hour production of cortisol and epinephrine was higher. During the jogging periods, their 24-hour cortisol and epinephrine production were actually about 30% lower. This is stress reactivity in action here, and it's being suppressed with actually pretty modest amounts of activity. So the metabolic adjustments that can frustrate weight loss are actually one of the reasons exercise is so good for you. Okay, moving along. If I haven't succeeded in picking a fight yet, we'll get there. Hold on a second. All right. Another thing that you hear out there that I think is counterintuitive and is just not correct is this idea that calories don't matter. I can tell you, if you ever engage on social media at all in these issues of diet or exercise, and you even suggest that calories might be responsible for things like weight gain or weight loss, you'll get eye rolls and you'll get yelled at on Twitter by people who tell you, oh, calories don't matter. It's not calories in and calories out. It's not that simple. Well, actually, it really kind of is that simple. Calories are all that matters, right? Every calorie in your body, every calorie that you carry in terms of fat or other tissue is a calorie of food that you ate and didn't burn off. And so the reason I've got this picture here, this is Antoine Lavoisier's laboratory. He's actually the guy who figured this out along with his buddy Simon Laplace. They put a guinea pig inside this double-walled metal chamber. They packed the walls, the interior space between the walls with snow, and they measured how much carbon dioxide was produced to how much snow is melted by measuring the water. And they were able to determine that metabolism is just simple combustion, right? So in other words, our bodies burn fuel the same way that a fire burns wood, that we obey the laws of thermodynamics. Probably don't need to convince anybody of that here of that, but it's an important thing to remember that it really does come down to calories. Now, it can be really frustrating to try to keep track of calories, and it can seem like calories don't matter because humans are incredibly bad at keeping track of them. And so one of the reasons I think people have given up on calories is that we're just useless at counting them. If you compare self-reported intake to measured calories per day for 1 week, and this is 324 people across 5 countries, so this is cross-cultural, men and women, what you find is that on average, this is amount of underreporting. So this is at 30%, you reported 30% fewer calories eaten than you actually did. On average, people miss about a third of the calories they eat. Whether that's missed or forgotten or just unrecorded is actually immaterial. The point is, you're not good, if you are a typical human, at keeping track of the calories that you put through your body. That's why I think calories seem not to matter. Into the breach of this sort of rejection of calories is this idea that maybe the types of calories matter, that if you eat more carbs or more fats, that's what really determines your fat percentage and your body composition. And that doesn't actually match either with the data. So if you assign people to different kinds of macronutrient diets, right? So this is a great example of this, but there are others. You assign 160 adults to 4 different diets from meat-based to plant-based, and then you see how much weight they lose. What you find is that weight loss is the same on average across all these different weight diet categories, diet types. And the weight loss is pretty modest here, but it's also quite variable. And what you find is that people who stick to the diets, right, the better your adherence is, the more weight you lose. And it doesn't matter what diet you stick to. And people are equally good at sticking to different diets. So the dietary type doesn't matter. Any diet works if you stick to it, and they all work the same way, by cutting calories. So all diets succeed or fail by cutting calories. The macronutrient content has almost nothing, in fact, statistically speaking, absolutely nothing to do with how well they work. All right. And that leads us to number 5 here, this idea that humans evolved to eat a meat-heavy paleo diet. If we work with women in the Hadza population, here's women digging tubers, working very hard to not get meat. In fact, Hadza diets are very carb heavy. These starchy tubers are a big part of the diet, also very fibrous. And I think that's an important thing to remember. Meat is important, but it can be scarce, and it's always lean. It's never as fatty as we see in domesticated animals. And honey, by the way, is also another big part of the diet, which is just sugar and water. In the Hadza and in other populations who live where honey is available, honey makes up 15 to 20% of the diet on average, in terms of calories eaten per day. But it's really variable. And so if we look across months here, this is data that was initially compiled by Frank Marlowe and Colette Berbesque, and we've converted it here to daily energy intake in a paper that I've written with Brian Wood as in Press. This is month by month intakes into camps. We actually measure the food they bring into camp from different food sources. And just the point here, you can see by the variation in color that some months there's hardly any meat, some months there's a lot, some months there's hardly any honey, some months there's a lot, et cetera, et cetera. So traditional diets are diverse across time. Any 2 weeks are likely to be quite different. Any 2 months are likely to be quite different. They're also different across space. And so here's the percentage of the diet from animals, and this is data from the Murdoch Atlas, if you're familiar with that. 260 populations that primarily hunting and gathering, but some of them do a little bit of farming or pastoralism. And you can see that, yes, as you move towards Arctic, into Arctic landscapes where there's fewer plants, people eat fewer plants, they eat more animals. But in warmer climates, people eat a mixture of plants and animals, a really diverse mixture of plants and animals. All right. And so if we were to look at, for example, the Hadza, Chimani, or Shuar diets, and by the way, all 3 of these populations have basically almost no cardiometabolic disease, no issues with obesity, very healthy. They're actually all quite high carb compared to the typical, the typical US intake. This is NHANES self-reported dietary intake. And they're also way more carb heavy than so-called paleo diets that we see suggested by people like Lorraine Cordain or Perlmutter here. So the idea that paleo diets, so-called, reflect actually measured hunter-gatherer diets just doesn't wash at all. Hunter-gatherers are diverse. Many are carb heavy. Many could be meat heavy. That's fine. But the idea that they're all meat heavy just doesn't wash. All right. A couple things to wrap up here then. Myth 6, this idea that a slow metabolism dooms you to obesity. You hear about, I can't seem to manage my weight because I have a slow metabolic rate. Well, let's have a look at that. Here's daily energy expenditure against fat-free mass. These are data picked from my lab. And you can see that there is variation. People who are larger tend to burn more calories. But even around that trend line, right, there is variation. There are people who burn a lot of calories for how large they are, or fewer calories for how large they are. That doesn't correspond very well to activity, as we said before. But we can ask the question, do people up here who burn more calories than you'd expect for their size, are they protected from weight gain? Are the people down here doomed to weight gain? And in fact, we've looked at that now. Rebecca Rimbach, who's a postdoc in my lab, has looked at this data. And here's weight change versus whether you have a fast or slow metabolism for your body size. And there is absolutely no relationship. Having a fast metabolism does not protect you from weight gain. Having a slow metabolism doesn't doom you to weight gain. And then therefore, it's no surprise that when if we were to bin these people by their BMIs, we'd see there's no relationship between your BMI and whether you tend to fall above or below the size corrected trend line. Okay, so metabolism doesn't doom you to obesity. And metabolism actually doesn't have a whole lot to do with your likelihood of being obese. It just doesn't work that way. Your metabolism actually responds to weight and weight change rather than dictating weight change. So why does it feel then like some people have a slow metabolism and have a harder time than others keeping weight off? And I think the evidence there, and this is data from other labs, I'm not a geneticist, but points to genetics as being a big factor here, and the way that our brains are wired and the way that our brains perceive energy intake and dictate and respond with affecting energy expenditure. If we look at GWAS studies of metabolism and of BMI, this is from the large UK biobank sample. We look at where all of the genes related to BMI are, and there's hundreds of them that have been identified. They're all active in the brain, right? And they're active in the brain because that is the organ that determines energy balance. It determines how full you feel after a meal. It determines how much you ramp your metabolic rate up or down in response to lifestyle changes. And so the seat of energy balance is in our brain. And it's no surprise then that the genes involved in weight maintenance and overweight are most active in the brain. And that leads us to the last one here, and I'll wrap it up. The idea that obesity is a sign of personal failure. This is the suggestion of every, fat shaming, you have to work out, you're not working out hard enough kind of workout program online. And I think it's just absolutely silly. And it's an idea that actually goes back hundreds of years. This is Hieronymus Bosch's 7 deadly sins, and sloth and gluttony are right there, right? So this is an old idea that if you are not at a healthy weight, that is a sign of personal failure or lack of willpower. I don't think it's that at all. We surround ourselves with a food environment that is completely different than our evolutionary past. In fact, we've been able to flip one of the general, ironclad ecological rules on its head. Any animal that goes out into the wild to get food can either get low energy food that's easy to get, like leaves, or high energy food that's hard to get, like animals, right? So usually the harder of the more energy dense a food is, the harder it is to obtain. In your supermarket, it's exactly the opposite. The most energy dense foods are the cheapest to obtain. Okay. And so we have completely flipped our food environments around in a really perverse way, and we respond really poorly. If you feed people ultra-processed foods versus unprocessed foods in a within subjects crossover design, this is work by Kevin Hall, people gain weight when they eat ultra-processed foods. They actually lose weight in this study over 2 weeks when they eat unprocessed foods. And I should mention these diets are matched for carbs, fats, protein, fiber. The macronutrient content doesn't dictate what's going on here. It's the processing and all of the flavor engineering and everything else that goes into ultra processed foods that makes it really hard for our Paleolithic brains to handle. And they lead us to overeat. And what should worry us is that these are the foods that are more and more common, in fact, most common in our diet. So percentage of your calories from ultra processed foods. This is Canada from 1930 on. They've actually gone over half their diet is calories from ultra processed foods. The UK and the US are right there as well. And this is a growing problem in the lower and middle income countries as well. So this is a global issue, and it matches the fact that cardiometabolic disease is, again, the #1 killer globally. And so I'll just wrap it up quickly and say that what this says is, your metabolism is a clever and dynamic machine. The kind of simplistic ways that we often think about metabolism, that we can boost it with exercise, or I think we need to rethink that. I think that your evolved metabolism is a lot more clever than that. If we want to watch our weight, we need to watch our diet, and particularly we need to get ultra processed foods out of our food environments. And like the Hadza and everybody else who's in these traditional populations, we need to be active throughout the day. Exercise is still critically important. It just doesn't have the effect on metabolism as we're often taught. And if you want to hear more about the Hadza, please go here, hadzafund.org. And as Charlie said very nicely, thank you. A lot of this work and other stuff is in my book, Burn, which I hope you'll check out if you're interested. Thank you.
Great job, Herman. That was fantastic. Thanks very much for that. Before we turn to the questions that are popping up in the chat, I want to invite Eric Willis to give some comments and perspective. As by way of brief introduction, Eric is in the UNC Center for Health Promotion and Disease Prevention. His interests focus on public health and clinical approaches to understanding the benefits of physical activity, weight loss, and sedentary time on health. He has PhD and master's degrees in exercise physiology and an MPH, the MPH from Yale, and he completed his postdoctoral fellowship in the Cancer Prevention Fellowship Program at the National Cancer Institute. So welcome, Eric, and please take 3-4 minutes, however long you need, to give some perspective.
Thanks for everyone for inviting me. I said I wasn't going to share slides, but I might actually put a couple up here just to go after myth number 2 just a little bit. I don't totally disagree with what he said, but he did want a little bit of an argument. So one of the big things with exercise trials and weight loss is our recommendations of how we prescribe exercise in minutes. When we're really looking at exercise energy expenditure, or what we're promoting for exercise for weight loss, we're really promoting a good decent amount of exercise of 225 minutes per week. But what ends up happening when we recommend exercise, everyone seeing my slides, by the way? Yeah. Okay. When we look at exercise prescribed by 225 minutes, what we actually do see is a lot of variation in weight change, where a lot of men will lose some weight, and females will pretty much have even amount of weight loss and weight gain in that range for the same amount of minutes. What we actually see is because people are burning a lot of different energy expenditure during that same amount of time, and it's really driven by body weight. So we actually see almost a 200 kcal of energy expenditure difference between males and females doing the same amount of exercise of about 225 minutes. So when we actually try to dose exercise based on exact energy expenditure, so these are both males and females exercising at 400 calories per session, or males or females exercising at 600 kcals per session, the minutes that exercising is quite varied. So 180-pound female might have to exercise for an hour and a half, or the male may only have to exercise for 55 minutes, but they're burning the same amount of calories. So the amount of minutes that you're exercising is quite different. What we actually see now is males and females actually respond very similarly to the exercise and weight loss. And you actually do see almost a 5% weight loss on average in the group. There's still variability there, but we are seeing clinically meaningful weight loss from exercise alone without any real diet changes in this group. So when we dose exercise, what I argue a little bit is that most of the diet or the exercise studies out there have been not dosing exercise correctly to see this difference, where we only see the 2 kg difference on average. When we're dosing, making people exercise to an energy expenditure that could equate to weight loss, we do see clinically meaningful difference. Now, what else is interesting about exercise and energy expenditure is getting into like when you're exercising. You can talk about exercise as medicine. When you think about how you take medicine, you get prescribed medicine, take it before a meal, on a full stomach, in the morning, in the evening, all these different things. Well, if exercise is medicine, maybe that's something similar. So we went back and looked at exercise by time of day, and we actually see that people who exercise in the morning doing the same amount of energy expenditure from exercise are almost losing 4% more body weight for the same amount of exercise compared to someone exercise later in the day. This is secondary analysis, so we still have some more trying to study this further in future trials, but we actually see the variability in weight loss is also much better for morning exercisers, where almost 81% hit amount of energy expenditure they're burning, only 36% hitting that same amount of weight loss. So there's a lot of things that go into this, and there's a lot of variability that we may just not be individualizing these exercise prescriptions well enough to elicit the weight change that we want. And there's a lot of work still, and getting into precision medicine and how we can individualize these programs. Maybe exercise isn't as futile for weight loss for everyone. Maybe some people that will be helpful for. Now, to say that the body doesn't constrain energy expenditure, I'm not going to disagree with that, because we're dosing these energy expenditures at 400 and 600 calories. But when we look at doubly labeled water from these individuals, they're only increasing their total daily energy expenditure maybe 200 to 300, so maybe only 50% of this. We also see this in some cohort data from the NCI with 24-hour recalls, where only about 50% of the energy expenditure from the physical activity is explained by total energy expenditure. So there is some constraint actually happening here, but there may be some ways that exercise could still produce the weight loss that that we desire. And last, I'll just show you a little clip from a paper that I actually worked on with Herman, looking at a constrained energy expenditure model here with a cohort from the National Institute of Health, where we actually see where people are more in an energy surplus, so consuming more energy than they need, they're gaining weight over time, or maintaining that weight over time. We don't actually see that constraint at higher levels of physical activity like you do when maybe that there is an energy, negative energy balance, or you're trying to diet where your body is needing to conserve energy because of a lack of food in the environment. So I'll just stop there for discussion, but I just wanted to share those couple slides that I have that just that it might be helpful for some people.
Okay, thank you, Eric. How should we proceed here? First of all, Herman, did you have anything you wanted to say in relation to any of that? And then
no, I think it's great. And one thing I would say about the the late morning, late day versus early day effect, and just the variability in response that you get to exercise. To me, that the other thing we could add is that exercise helps you keep weight off. So when people do lose a lot of weight, often they are able to keep it off better when they exercise. And so all of that to me suggests a sort of regulation effect of exercise, that some exercise is helping your brain do a better job, match intake and expenditure. Because I can't think of another reason that a given calorie workload would lose weight in one case but not in another. To me, that sounds like you're affecting circadian patterns of regulation of energy expenditure and intake. And so yeah, I think that it would be interesting to kind of grow the way that we think about exercise beyond just the muscle gain or the energy expenditure during the exercise, and think about the way it's affecting everything throughout the body in terms of regulation of energy intake. So that's stuff that people have worked on here. I see Dan Lieberman's here. That's something I'm sure that he would be interested in talking about as well. Probably a lot of us might have a piece of this to add, but yeah, I'll stop there and turn it over to a broader set of questions.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off what you said, when they looked at individuals who maintain their weight, after weight loss, the amount of exercise they're doing, their total energy expenditure is now what they see is it's matched back to the pre-weight loss total energy expenditure. So they're filling that gap with the extra physical activity. Yeah. So you have to do quite a bit of exercise to be back to where you normally would.
Yep.
Okay, I'm going to turn things over to Meredith to handle the questions. I think we've been working out a little bit of a plan behind the scenes here. Go ahead, Meredith.
Yeah, so feel free to raise your hand at any point. I think Zoom has moved that to the reactions now. So at the bottom of your screen, you can hit reactions and then raise hand if you have a question. But to start us off, I'll go for a question in the chat from Sarah Runzer. Sarah asks, variations in daily calorie consumption is significant in everyone's diet. So how can anyone maintain a constant body weight if calories actually matter? Why does our metabolism burn extra calories on a daily basis to maintain a constant body weight?
Isn't that amazing? And it's absolutely right that your intake and your expenditure are both variable over the course of a day. So over the course of day to day. But, just to kind of put some numbers on it, right? A pound of weight, body weight, is about 3,500 calories. That's not so far off from, a daily energy expenditure, somebody's daily energy expenditure of about 3,000 calories for a man. Now, the amount of calories you burn per pound are going to vary depending on if it's fat or protein or whatever, but as a ballpark, 3,500 kilocalories per pound. If you gain 2 pounds a year, which is, by the way, the American obesity crisis, right? It's not 10 pounds a year, it's 2 pounds a year. Then you have mismatched intake and expenditure by 2 over 365, right? A fraction of a fraction, right? So your brain, even in this ridiculous world we live in, where energy is so available and activity levels change day to day and intake changes day to day, over the long term is matching intake and expenditure to within 99.9+%. When we look at the Hadza, who do not plan their diets at all, right? And food intakes are variable and activity is variable. I can tell you, I've seen the data. If you look at men who we've measured in the late 90s or early 2000s, they have the same body weight as last time I was there, 2019. So, stable body weight is the norm in a healthy human population. And it really does come down to the fact that your body can just match intake and expenditure. In terms of, is there evidence for your body ramping up or ramping down and expenditure? There absolutely is. Mike Rosenbaum and Rudy Leibel's work on this is probably the best from the 90s. But both of those things are under control and matched over sort of week-long time horizons, we think.
Great, thank you. Next, we had a question from Jillian Pepper. Jillian, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Hi, yeah, thanks. That was really interesting. My question to you, other than how does the music get inside the radio, which I'm just joking, is given that the energetic costs of reproduction are so different for men and women. I was really struck by that with your some of the things you've written and kind of equating pregnancy to marathon running, for example. What can we say about how that shaped energetic trade-offs, and might there be sort of sex-specific health consequences for that?
Yeah, and I suspect that this is a big reason of why men and women can respond to exercise, for example, differently, or diet changes differently. You would expect that women would be, there would be evolved mechanisms in there to sort of protect body fat, to protect that reserve for reproduction. And so the amount of constraint or response, I wouldn't be surprised if there's a sex difference there. What I will say is that we are trying to track that down. I think it's early enough days in people sort of recognizing this phenomenon that we don't really have the studies that are needed to test how this works. But I'm with you. I would expect, my hypothesis would be that there's a sex effect there.
Can I be cheeky and just add a little bit to that question then? So one of the reasons that I'm really interested in this is that the association between food insecurity and obesity is most obvious in women. And I'm sort of trying to understand why that might be. Do you have any comments on that?
What comes to mind is Meredith Reich's work with Peter Ellison in the Gambia, looking at women who go through puberty either before or after Ramadan. And whether, not that it's that short of an event, but it's I'll try to get it right here, but the timing of menarche, and whether, and it's also whether or not you go into that phase of your life already at a higher or lower body fat percentage, determines how you respond to that event and to the resumption of feeding that happens afterwards. And women who are energy stressed, and I think the measure might have been like stature for age or something like that, put that energy into fat. Women who are not stressed put that energy into growth, into linear growth. And it's what you'd expect, that like if you are in a good environment, you can bank on that and become bigger, and there's lots of benefits from that. If not, you bank it into fat. I butchered that paper for her, but you should check it out, right? Just REICHES. And there's probably other work on that too, but that's what I'm put in mind of that work there.
Thank you.
Great, thank you. So we had a question in the chat for Eric from Andrew Malik. Andrew asks, is there a difference in the exercise groups if they were eating before their prescribed workouts?
That's actually the one question that we really wanted to know. Of all the things that were collected in that study, the time of the meal before exercise was not collected. We actually are in the process of starting up a study that will hopefully answer that question. If it was fasted exercise that was driving it. That's one of the hypotheses that we think that may be the reason that the exercise was done prior to a meal or a 12-hour fast of some sort.
Great, thank you. Another interesting question in the chat from Marianne Barrier. Marianne had asked, has anyone studied BMI versus circadian clocks, such as in birds with different circadian rhythms like larks and owls, or anything along those lines?
I think circadian biology here is sort of one of the next frontiers. For example, your basal metabolic rate, we measure that at 7 in the morning or 8 in the morning. And then when we kind of recapitulate and reconstruct your energy budget, right? We think that we sort of assume that BMR kind of stays the same all day. But of course, we know that resting metabolic rate actually fluctuates as your body becomes more active, during the awake part of the day, it becomes less active at night. And so there's a circadian fluctuation to resting metabolic rate there that is completely ignored when we reconstruct metabolic rates and energy budgets for people. And so does that translate, if you are a early or late sleeper or on your circadian schedule and matched to light cycle or not? Ken Wright actually has done interesting work looking at the metabolic effects of sleep disruption and circadian disruption. And so it does seem to affect weight gain. But that's different than if you're a lark or an owl. So, but I think this is the next frontier to go.
Great, thank you.
Hey, Herman, if I
All
could
right.
ask a question, since this is a quiet crowd, I don't know why we're not seeing all the hands up. Everybody wants to put things in the chat today. So I'll take advantage of that and ask a quick question before we have to wrap up here in a few minutes. In your myth number 6, that was the slow metabolism one. You had this plot from your lab, metabolic rate versus fat-free mass, and you said that these residuals didn't explain variation, in your outcome. What does explain the variation in those residuals? I mean, is it just that there's noise in the measurements, or what
so it's not noise. We know it's not noise because it's stable. We know it's stable. So if you are a high residual person today, you'll be a high residual person in 10 years. Most of the follow-up data are less than 10 years, but some are that long, and it's a stable measurement. Beyond that, Eric, what do you think? Why do some people have higher than lower? I mean, it's a completely ignored issue of sort of why you have this variation, but it seems important because that was a log plot, but to give you a sense, two people with the same size, body composition, activity level, all that stuff can vary quite easily by 500 calories a day. Somebody that could easily be 250 calories a day above the line, somebody 250 calories a day below. That's a big difference.
It looks like Peter, thanks Herman for that. I'm sorry, were there anything else you want to say about that, Eric or Pete?
I was going to say add.
Okay.
Dad.
Sorry, I was on the screen looking for somebody with a hand up. Peter, it looked like you had Peter Sterling. Did you have your hand up? Now we lost him. Okay, we have time for one last question. Peter, if you had a question, please go ahead and unmute yourself and ask it. And otherwise, if anybody has a question, go for it. Looks like Aaron Blackwell is going to fill in this last couple of minutes.
Hey, Herman, thanks for the talk.
Have you here.
I have a question about the use of the term constrained energy expenditure, and really what's constraining that. I mean, it seems quite clear that humans and other animals can exceed that for short periods of time.
Yeah.
Then they go back to it short after a while. So it's not like it's constrained by oxygen throughput or something like that. So I'm wondering I guess what's constraining it, and should we call that a target rather than a constraint or something? Is it really a constraint?
Yeah, that's a good question. I can tell you that we've looked at this. So how high can you push your metabolic rate for how long? And there seems to be a really clear relationship between how the maximum you can push your metabolic rate in something like a Kona triathlon, Tour de France. We did a study of people who ran from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C., a marathon a day for 5 months, which is absurd. But, pregnancy is the longest and highest expenditure thing that we can find in the literature. 9 months at about 3,500 calories a day on average. I think it is a constraint because I think when you try to push past it, bad things happen. When you end up against that metabolic limit, and you get things like overtraining syndrome, and you get other kinds of problems. What is the limit? I think it has to be on the energy supply side, because we see this limit being constraining all sorts of different activities where the end users of the energy are different. And so it seems like the energy intake is the key, the common feature, the common link. But yeah, is that, is it more than that? Gosh, I don't know. And, Eric's group with the Midwest exercise trials has shown that you can get people who increase their metabolic rates by a couple hundred calories a day. That can last at least for a year or two, maybe longer. So, how tight is this? I don't know. But it does seem to be a constrained system. Exactly how much constraint versus target and what, I think we're still working all that stuff out. Eric?
The other interesting thing was when we looked at our subgroup of those who were in negative energy balance, and I didn't have that figure pulled up, was where Herman first showed his, there was a decrease or an inflection. It increased for a little while and dropped down. But what we saw in this negative energy balance, that there was no increase. It was a straight flat line that just went across. There was no association whatsoever with physical activity and total daily energy expenditure. And don't know why, but in that subgroup, there was something to do with them being in the negative energy balance, that it was just straight and flat. So yeah, it's something with energy intake must be driving it somehow.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to get at the difference between like a physical constraint based on the laws of physics versus a constraint that's imposed by mechanisms that have been selected for to, maintain the body over long-term periods of time or something. Yeah,
I suspect it's a mechanisms to do with energy absorption and then metabolism, in the sense of taking nutrients and making them into usable other nutrients and building blocks. So, the gut wall and the liver would be first places to look, I think, for how this gets bottlenecked. And those would be under selection, of course.
Okay, that was a great question, Aaron. Thanks so much for that and for the responses, Herman and Eric. This was a great conversation. Thanks so much, Herman, Eric, for sharing your perspectives. And Meredith, thank you so much for organizing everything. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. It was great to see such a big crowd today and so many familiar faces. Now, before we totally, split off into our other lives, I want to share with you quickly, first of all, a podcast that's coming out on Thursday featuring Herman, the Big Biology Podcast. TriSem helped support this, and we're really looking forward to hearing it. It's going to be available on Thursday. This is a great podcast. If you don't listen to it already, it's a good one to subscribe to. I can highly recommend it. So tune into that on Thursday. And then looking a little further out, you should be seeing now the Club EvMed website. We've got a great lineup of people coming in the future with Sandra Broom Anderson and some others on March 25th. But then Joe Henrik, Zane Thayer, Beth Archie, and Chelsea Weibel, a whole bunch of other people. I want to highlight, though, that we have a postdoc spotlight here that you can nominate someone to speak, a postdoc to speak for a 12-minute talk. We'll have 2 or 3 of these in that hour, and also a student spotlight. So this is in late April for the postdoc and May for the student, late May. Please submit some nominations there so that we get a great lineup of speakers for those 2 events, and people who can really, it's an opportunity for them to really showcase their work, share their findings. Okay, with that, I'll say thanks again to everyone. Great to see so many people here. Thanks.